Hello, welcome to Navigating ESG Reporting for your organizational needs. I'm Janice Parson, and I'll be presenting the session for you today. To provide a brief introduction, again, I'm Janice Parson, VP within RGP's Project Consulting Services team. I lead a number of cross-functional initiatives within finance, accounting, and risk and compliance. And I also have significant experience in leading reporting implementation initiatives with standards and frameworks. To provide a little bit about RGP, RGP is a global consulting company that serves over 2,400 clients, which includes 3/4 of the Fortune 500. RGP enables rapid business outcomes by bringing together the right people who together create transformative change. Now for today's agenda, I'll be providing a brief introduction to ESG reporting, talk a little bit more about the regulatory drivers, and then I will conclude with discussing the strategic drivers as well as reporting implications. Now, to provide background on ESG reporting, or ESG, environmental, social, and governance, this topic is not new. Over 90% of the SP 500 already voluntarily publish sustainability reports in some form or fashion. But there's been also increasing funds and investments around this topic as well. So you can see here, 120 billion net new money in Q1 and Q2 this year internationally focused on sustainability funds. Also, 370 billion invested in target emission reduction from the Inflation Reduction Act. So you can see here, there are significant interests to invest and report. Proponents say that companies' ESG efforts may influence how they purchase or invest in a company, and companies want a way to share how they're acting responsibly with their employees, customers, suppliers, and the environment. But there are also critics, such as the ESG ratings developed that rank companies on how they're performing on ESG factors, and it has created some frustration for some. The other aspect is the question of the fund or the investment products labeled with ESG. Now, I'll provide a brief background around ESG reporting and the reporting work streams associated first, and then discuss the drivers next. When companies are having to include ESG information in the financial statements, these tend to be more regulatory driven. On the right, you can see beyond the financials, this reporting work stream is more strategic in nature when companies are sharing their ESG efforts in terms of within a sustainability report or on their website. Now, in terms of the drivers to the different aspects of reporting shared earlier, I'll first introduce these increasing drivers and trends, but I'll cover in more detail in the later sections. Now, from a regulatory driver perspective, there are a number of activities that's been happening, such as with human capital disclosures, to the proposed rules that the SEC has currently have out, standard setting changes, as well as international requirements. Now, I've listed the regulatory drivers here as these directly impact the financial statements, but I'll elaborate a bit more in the next section. And because of the wave of the activities and the fundings mentioned earlier, the regulatory and standard setting bodies are really paying attention on how companies are reporting on ESG matters. But stepping back, considering from a broader ESG reporting context, I'll also discuss the strategic drivers. And mentioned earlier, over 90% of the SP 500 already voluntarily publish sustainability reports in some form or fashion. But what is driving this interest to report on ESG matters? Now, having a more formal ESG program can help set clear goals and expectations that are recognizable by a broader audience and hold the management and internal stakeholders more accountable. Whether you represent a public or a private organization, having structure can help you communicate the ESG efforts and progress to the community, creditors, or investors at large. It's also important to understand and set the goals and targets specific to your industry. So while certain topics are applicable and relevant across industries, such as the climate change, diversity and inclusion, and ethics and governance, it's also important to tailor and set the priorities and goals that you have significant impact to your organization. And there are multiple standards and frameworks that have been available for some time, but there are specific standards and frameworks that companies tend to utilize for sustainability reporting and climate-specific disclosures, which I'll introduce next. And these provide a common global language to communicate sustainability-related impacts. The first one I'll mention here is GRI, so Global Reporting Initiative. And this provides a widely used standards for sustainability reporting. These are structured by specific topics, along with defined metrics to report on, and the topic-specific standards help guide or recommend companies on the reporting disclosures and metrics to consider. And although the organization has plans to develop more industry sector-specific guidance, there are only a few available at this time. So look at figure 1 and the topic listed for example here. You have the overview set of the standards. That's our universal. And then you dive down a little bit deeper in terms of topic specific, in terms of what's relevant and applicable to you, and selecting that for your organization. So for example, if diversity is important to your organization, then you would refer to topic 405, diversity. And in terms of, from a diversity perspective, you would want to present the diversity of the governance bodies and employees as a percentage by gender, by age group, and other indicators. And then as well as present metrics on the ratio of basic salary and compensation of women to men for each of these employee categories. Now, Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB, focuses on guiding the disclosure of financially material sustainability information by companies to their investors. And now it's actually part of IFR's Foundation and the International Sustainability Standards Board, or IFSB, oversight starting this year. It's structured by industry classification and focused on financially material metrics, and the guidance suggests topics for the industry and describes specific accounting metrics to consider reporting on. As you can see in the figure, the first column to the left references the topic, and then the second column references the accounting metric, as I was describing earlier. And from an industry perspective, SASB provides additional industry categories to consider. For example, in this case, consumer goods for 7 category variations to consider. There's been significant discussion in the past for companies to disclose on climate risk and emissions, but the SEC proposal brought this topic front and center. But before I go into more detail in providing information in the next section, I thought I'd just share a little bit of background as you're hearing about references to Scope 1, Scope 2, or Scope 3 emissions. For Scope 1 emissions, Scope 1 is pertaining to emissions that are direct greenhouse gas emissions that occurs from sources that are controlled or owned by the organization. For Scope 2, emissions are indirect greenhouse gas emissions associated with the purchase of electricity, steam, heat, or cooling. Scope 3 emissions are the result of the activities that from assets not owned or controlled by the reporting organization, but that the organization indirectly impacts in its value chain. This also tends to be the largest contribution of emissions for many organizations. For climate-specific standards and framework, there are the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or frequently referred to as TCFD, which develops recommendations on information that companies should disclose to support external stakeholders in assessing risk related to climate change. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which provides framework to measure and manage emissions from private and public sector operations and value chains. And then Science-Based Target Initiative, which defines and promotes best practice in emission reduction and net zero targets in line with climate science. Next, I'd like to talk a bit about regulatory drivers. And very similarly to what I had shared earlier, this is what I like to cover related to regulatory drivers. So to dive into this, there are multiple developments from multiple fronts. And related to the financial statements for public companies, the SEC has already issued an amendment that requires businesses to include human capital disclosures that were already effective or became effective in late 2020. But for proposed rules, there are two of them here, which I'll elaborate in the next few slides. Now, from a financial reporting and accounting standard perspective, applicable to all U.S. public, private, or nonprofits, this is on the accounting for environmental credit programs. And this is on the FASB's agenda to assess the requirements for participants and compliance and voluntary programs that lead to the creation of environmental credits. And the credits may include those created under the compliance programs, such as emissions trading involving federal and regional programs, renewable energy credits or certificates, and carbon offsets credits. And really the focus here is for credits that are enforceable and traded, so it doesn't pertain to the tax credits or investment related. And the topic initiated because of the diversity in practice without much direct guidance, such as whether the transactions can be accounted for as inventory or intangible assets when purchased. It's still in the early deliberations, but I really just wanted to bring up for awareness, since organizations are increasingly engaging ways to reduce carbon emissions, and credits are one way to do that. Now, in terms of other activities, I'll just briefly mention here because these are more investment related. For the SEC, the ESG disclosures for investment advisors and investment companies. The goal of the proposed rule is to be able to determine whether a fund or an advisor's ESG marketing statements really represent concrete and specific measures taken to address ESG goals and portfolio allocation, and requiring the companies to disclose their ESG strategies. For FASB, this is a research project focused on the accounting for financial instruments with ESG-linked features, because there are increasing investments such as bonds where the returns are varying based on sustainability-linked metrics. And as I mentioned earlier, we have the Scope 1 emissions that are direct greenhouse gas emissions. We have the Scope 2 emissions that are indirect greenhouse gas emissions associated with the purchase of electricity, steam, heat, and cooling. And then we have the Scope 3 emissions that are results of the activities from assets not owned or controlled by the reporting organization. And I'm mentioning here for the next topic, which is the SEC proposed climate-related disclosures. As many of you are aware, in March 2022, the SEC proposed rules to enhance and standardize climate-related disclosures as the investment community is demanding for more consistent, comparable, and reliable information across companies. The proposed disclosures, specifically on climate-related risk, would require public companies to disclose specific content when they're submitting the filing and registration statements or annual reports, depending on the timing. And this includes having to include oversight and governance, material impact to the business and future outlooks, process to identify, assess, and manage the risk, greenhouse emissions, impact of climate-related events, and this includes disclosing financial impact when sum is cumulatively greater than 1% of a significant line item, financial line item in the financials. Details on climate-related targets or goals publicly set or stated, and then any other information such as scenario analysis or transition plans defined. This also means information disclosed would need to be in XBRL and subject to SEC's rule on disclosure controls and procedures. Now, for larger organizations or accelerated filers, an additional requirement is to obtain an attestation report from an independent attestation service provider on Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And the SEC proposal included a phased approach for implementation as shared here, but I would say the elements that are most sensitive for registrants or causing stirs are the limited and the reasonable assurance requirements and calculating the financial impact of climate-related events. The small reporting companies and non-accelerated are not listed here under the assurance requirements, but entities will still be subject to disclosure controls and procedures. Now, we've also published a blog that provides a little bit more details here under our RGP Insights if the audience here is interested in learning more. As cybersecurity becomes increasingly external risk to companies, I thought it's fitting here just to mention for governance purposes. The SEC also issued the significant proposal in March this year with the proposed rules and amendments to enhance and standardize disclosures regarding cybersecurity risk management, strategy, governance, incident reporting by public companies. And to expand a little bit more here, the requirements include amending the Form 8K to report material cybersecurity incidences within 4 business days of confirming materiality, although not based on the discovery date. And disclosing policies and procedures, management roles, and the board of director expertise on how entities are identifying and managing cybersecurity risks, as well as reporting on prior material incidences. Now, the element that may take some effort, additional effort for entities to reevaluate and agree to is what classifies as material cybersecurity incident report. The proposal provides a few examples, but it will be up to the entities to define further. And some of the examples that the SEC has provided includes unauthorized incident that has compromised the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of an information asset, or violating policies and procedures, unauthorized incident that caused degradation, interruption, or loss of control, or loss of operational technology systems, incident which an unauthorized party accessed, exceeded authorized access, altered or stolen sensitive business information, or an incident in which the malicious actor has offered to sell or has threatened to publicly disclose sensitive company data. So these are just some of the examples that the SEC proposal included, but it really is up to the organization or the entity to make sure that is defined clearly. Now, next, on the international front, the IFRS Foundation created the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, focused on sustainability-related disclosures to help investors make informed decisions about ESG matters. And there are two exposure drafts. The exposure drafts issued include the general sustainability-related disclosures, setting out overall requirements for an entity to disclose, climate-related disclosures, building upon the recommendations from TCFD. Now, when these ISSB standards are officially issued, these are not mandated unless the country or the jurisdictional authority decides that companies should comply. But interesting enough, the shift towards compliance is starting to happen internationally. And I will just highlight a few of these ones here. From a UK perspective, there are two. There's the Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting, or often referred to as CCAR, requires public companies to specifically disclose UK annual energy use and greenhouse gas emissions, applicable starting back in 2019. There's the TCFD disclosure requirements, requiring public, large private, and certain LLP companies to incorporate TCFD-aligned climate disclosures in their annual reports, applicable starting this year, 2022, for organizations over 500 employees. There's also, from the EU perspective, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. The EU will be adopting this new rule, requiring all large public companies to publish regular reports on ESG, targeting to be effective in 2024. And these are organizations pertaining to the EU. Next, I'm going to transition and talk a bit more about the strategic drivers and the reporting implications. So as I mentioned earlier, having a more formal ESG program can help set clear strategic goals and expectations that are recognizable by a broader audience. And it holds the management team as well as the internal stakeholders more accountable. Whether you represent a public or private organization, having structure helps you better communicate ESG efforts and progress to the community, investors at large, or stakeholders such as creditors and customers. Now, diving deeper into strategic drivers, in terms of the internal and external stakeholders are increasingly demand organizations to share and disclose their ESG efforts. And this may be coming from the employees to customers, to investors, to possibly creditors. So for example, in healthcare, the social aspect of ESG is inherent, and it's been part of the organization's mission for many, such as supporting the underserved communities. But more recently, other aspects of ESG, such as environmental and governance, are really gaining traction. And increasingly enough, from external stakeholder perspective, ESG considerations are increasingly being identified explicitly in credit rating methodology as components of hospital or health systems' wider performance, according to the Foundation of the American College of Healthcare Executives. Now in retail, customers are increasingly wanting to know how companies are addressing ESG concerns. According to the Global Data's Market Pulse Consumer Survey in 2020, customers are more likely to pay a premium for sustainability-aligned causes, and 81% of customers would be willing to pay more for products supporting environmental protection. It's important to understand and set the goals and targets specific to your industry and organization. But what does this mean? This means your priorities should be customized to your organization's industry profile And once the priorities are established, drill down further and understand what specific metric goals and targets that are relevant and priorities for your business model. For a retail organization, there may be more specific goals to consider just based on what your organization offers and your business model. So from a multi-line e-commerce to apparel goods with brick and mortar locations, each would have different impacts to consider. And as a result, different goals and targets to consider. So to drill down the examples a bit more, for e-commerce, this may be focusing on product packaging and distribution to customer privacy, such as discussing strategies to reduce the environmental impact of product delivery, to quantifying the emissions of footprint of product shipments, or the descriptions of policies and procedures related to behavioral advertising and user privacy. For apparel goods, the organization may be more interested in raw material sourcing to labor conditions and the production of the apparel or fashion. So such as quantifying the percentage of raw materials that are third-party certified to an environmental or social sustainability standard, or including the percentage of supplier facilities that have been audited to a labor code of conduct, or the percentage of total audits conducted, and with goals to increase that percentage. And then shifting to healthcare providers, this may be supporting the underserved communities to monitoring employee health and safety, such as discussing the strategy to manage or support the mix of patient insurance status, to sharing employee safety data, such as total recordable incident rate and the days away restricted and transferred, or focusing on supplier diversity and conducting supplier social assessments and disclosing the number of the participating suppliers. From a life sciences pharma perspective, this may be focusing on the safety of the clinical trials to supply chain management and the production of the drugs, such as discussing by world region of the management process to ensure the quality and the patient safety during clinical trials, and disclosing the number of FDA-sponsored inspections, or quantifying the percentage of supplier facilities participating in audit programs and the goals to increase the percentage. So while you may be communicating a number of these initiatives, having the structure and the framework can help you communicate and convey these efforts and hold your organization more accountable. Investors or other stakeholders will also want to be able to understand how organizations are holding themselves more accountable, setting the appropriate metrics, and monitoring the progress and the performance. Now, what I'd like to share next is the typical ESG reporting roadmap that companies undergo. And these stages include prioritizing the topics and determining materiality, setting target goals and metrics, executing on the reporting and related disclosures, establishing quality control, and reevaluating your set priorities and topics. Now, in terms of prioritizing your topics and determining materiality, this is driven by stakeholder and market input, as well as the industry profile, the business strategy, and such suggested standards. Setting the targets and goals and metrics is having to identify and set your target goals and metrics to the priority and material topics, and determining your base year for initial measure. Executing on reporting and related disclosures is having to establish your process and oversight to have accountability and report or update your related performance metrics. Establishing quality control and program management. So having to establish process or program to ensure the quality control of the data collected for reporting purposes. And then reevaluating your set priorities and topics. Just having to reevaluate on a periodic basis to ensure the continuous alignment to the business strategy. And what I've noticed here is that companies more often tend to encounter their challenges during the midpoint stages of executing the ESG reporting roadmap, these areas in red below. Now, to dive a little bit deeper, the typical challenges that organizations experience include adhering to standards and frameworks when reporting across multiple standards and frameworks, and trying to stay current and up to date with the changes or new releases that are happening. So for example, when TCFD issued new recommendations in October 2021, organizations needed to understand the degree of the changes and if also reporting to the CDP, the Global Environmental Disclosure System, how the 2022 questionnaire changed in connection to that. From a program management and governance perspective, having to determine if their new goals should be added and set appropriate measures and monitoring, or tracking against existing goals and evaluating progress along with that. So for example, do you have a governance process around adding or revising priorities or metrics and monitoring? Do you have an ESG committee that helps you govern the goals set or tracked? And from a data quality management perspective, having comfort on the quality of the metrics and the data gathered and reported. So for example, is the information collected comprehensive to the metrics being tracked, such as inclusive of the relevant regions or markets? Or is information reliable, such as is it trackable or includes supporting details? So going through the roadmap discussed earlier, you'll also want to anticipate these challenges and understand the reporting implications. From a reporting metric alignment perspective, I talked about how it's important to understand and set the goals and targets specific to your industry and organization. But also being able to stay current and up to date on the changes happening in the reporting structure and governance. I also mentioned holding organizations accountable by setting the metrics and monitoring the progress and the performance, but with oversight through program or committee involvement. With data collection and quality, I didn't discuss this one as much, but this is a common theme for companies to encounter challenges in the collection process or having concerns about the quality of the data captured. The situations vary across organizations, and since it's not necessarily just financial data, and the type of data varies. But organizations are at a minimum doing the due diligence to verify the data associated with the statements presented in the reports. Now with emissions data, this will change as I described earlier from a regulatory driver perspective. Reporting automation. This also widely varies by organization since there's not necessarily one specific tool that stands out yet, and companies will want to assess the current tools and software being used, at least initially. But the common theme is that there is interest to automate and to be able to reduce the time spent to consolidate the data. The arrow here, these are regulatory drivers I had discussed that impact throughout the reporting workstream, whether from a financial statement perspective or for sustainability reporting. And you don't necessarily want to consider separately since the regulatory drivers are also impacting the non-financial reporting workstreams. So to recap, having a more formal ESG reporting program can help set clear strategic goals and expectations that are recognizable by a broader audience. And it helps management and internal stakeholders hold the management team and internal stakeholders more accountable. Whether you represent a public or a private organization, having structure can help you communicate ESG efforts and progress to the community, investors at large, or other stakeholders such as creditors or customers. But along with this, you'll want to have enough support along the way and the right partners to help you along your ESG reporting roadmap and journey. Thank you for your time and attending this session and listening.